Hello and welcome to the first of my modeling and texturing tutorial videos. This video is going to be focused on Maya, and we're going to cover how to set up your project folder in your workspace, some basic modeling techniques, UV unwrapping, and color IDing. My next video will cover texturing in Substance Painter, and the third video in the series will cover building your shaders and applying materials in both Maya and Unreal Engine. I've enabled a keystroke display that appears at the bottom of your screen, but it doesn't display my mouse, unfortunately. So if you look at the cursor, the left click on my mouse will flash red, middle button is blue, and right button is green. I'll try to call out when I'm pressing them, but hopefully you can still identify it this way if I forget. So let's get right into it. So I've opened up Maya here, and we're going to go create a new project. And so the first thing you do when you create a new project is you want to set your project folder. So you'll go to File and down to Project Window. And then we click New and select where we want to save our folder. I've got this demo folder I'm going to save it to. And then we'll name our project and hit Accept. So Maya unfortunately doesn't automatically set your project. So you have to hit File again and go down to Set Project, and then it should, and then you just select the folder that we just created. So in this folder, you'll actually see it's created a whole bunch of more folders. So you can use these to keep everything you need for your scene together. So like drop all your texture maps into your source images, anything you export for your FBXs and models, send them all to assets. This way it keeps everything together, and if you do have to move the project around in your computer or send it to someone else for some reason, you don't have to remake textures, and the other person will get everything they need. So it's a good habit to do that as soon as you create your project. And then once you've set your project, you want to save your scene, which it'll automatically open into your new project folder that you've made and the scenes folder in there. And then we save. And then you can see at the top here, it will change to display the file path for the new folder that you've created. So to adjust our workspace, one thing you'll notice here is that my grid probably doesn't look like yours. So you can customize this however you'd like. If you go to Display, and you can hit Grid here and bring up your options. So I've set it to 1,000 units with grid lines every 100 units, and then I've changed the colors of my different lines. If you go to Windows and Settings and Preferences and bring up your preferences and go down to your settings, you can change the measurement that's being used for all your grid sizes. So I've set mine to centimeters, and I have grid lines every 100 units, so that means that each of these white lines is a meter. So this will help you a lot when it comes to making sure objects in your scene have the right scale. There's another trick that I'll show you in a little bit that helps with that as well. So I recommend keeping your outliner open. So if you look on the far left side here, you've got these four icons. The bottom one is the outliner, and this will show everything that you have in your scene. It's very useful to have open all the time. You'll also see on the right side, I've got the modeling toolkit, channel layer box. Oof, why did that get so big? Channel layer box and attribute editor, all kind of docked into the side here. If you don't have them listed here, they are up here as well. So there's the modeling toolkit. This is for your rigging settings. And then you've got one for the attribute editor and the tool settings, and then the channel box. So you can easily just click one of these to bring it up, and then just drag it over to the side. And you'll see different blue spots where you can dock it in. And so you can customize that to however you see fit. Personally, I like to have them just on the side there so I can open them quickly when I need them. Another way to adjust your viewport. So you've got these three symbols here. So this one is your perspective view. This one will give you 4 panels, and this one gives you 2 side by side. I find the 2 side by side is actually very useful for when you're animating. You can have one scene or turn on the film gate for one side so you can see what your output, what your clip is actually going to look like, and then you can adjust in the other side. You can always go to the panels and then perspective and then change what these are. I've only got the one camera in my scene right now, but if I create another one and then go back to the 2 layout, I can hit panels here and then change. So I have camera 1 and perspective view, or I could switch them around if I chose, however I'd see fit. For this, we're just going to be using the one main panel. Additionally, if you hit spacebar, you can get all your panels to display as well. And then you just hover over the panel that you want and hit spacebar again. I'm going to delete that extra camera as we do not need it. And so while most of you are aware that W, E, and R are your move, rotate, and scale tools, Q is your selection tool. So if you have an object and I'm sure you've done this where you're trying to like hold shift to select multiple things, but then you're accidentally hitting this, which is extruding and messing with your geometry. Use Q, because then you can still select things, but you don't have that gizmo getting in your way anymore. All right, and so before we start, like I said, I've already adjusted my grid here. But another way to make sure that you have the proper scale for your objects is to create or to bring in a human model. And so if you go into Windows and Content Browser, if you have Maya 2022 or before, then this Content Browser is in the General Editors menu. But if we open that and we go find our way down to bipeds, there is this human body. And so if we double click on it, by default, this body is the same size as the Unreal Engine default character. So if you are planning on moving to Unreal Engine or something like that, it's a really good basis for making sure that your things are going to be fit right in the scene. Additionally, actually for customizing your workspace, you can see I have like the timeline and slider down here. If you go to the UI elements, you can change what you have visible. So if you're not animating, you don't need the time slider. It's entirely up to what you want to have on there. Personally, I just like to have it all active. Bring my outliner in. I don't know why that got so big. And then we're going to keep the modeling toolkit open here on the right just for now. Actually, I'm going to bring in the channel box editor. So one thing about using a model for scale is, if I've got my objects down here and I want to click and drag, I'm going to accidentally grab that model, which we don't want to do. It's annoying, especially if you have multiple things in the scene. So what you can do is you can select the object, and if you look down here on your channel box at layer editor, there's these 4 symbols. The one on the far right will create a new layer and assign the selected object. So we can just hit that, and now our human figure here, who I'm going to name Jeff, is on his own layer. And so this first symbol is visibility. Hides and makes him reappear. The third symbol will give you either a blank, which means that he's just a piece of geometry with nothing special. If you hit the T, it's a template. And so it still shows you the wireframe grayed out, but you can no longer select Jeff in the scene. You can still select him in the outliner, but not in the viewport. And the third option is a reference. So now you can see all the polygons and his skin, but you still can't select him, again, unless you go to the outliner. So I find this is very useful for keeping things separate when you're trying to work on something. And let's just delete this cube I made. So as you know, creating an object, you've got all your different polygons up here. Personally, I find going up to this menu or over to the side panels a lot of the time is time consuming, a bit of a pain in the butt. And so I like to use the shift and right click menu. And so this menu is context sensitive. If you use it without having anything selected, you get the create polygon menu, and it's got all the same shapes that we have up here and in these menus as well. So we're just going to create a cylinder. Maya uses your measurement of 1 as a default for determining the size when you create something like this. And since I've got my default unit set to 1, this is 1 centimeter wide, which super, super small. Also, I just hit F there, which focuses in on whatever object you have selected. So when you first create your object, I'm just going to hide Jeff here for now. You can press Control T, which will give you all the different settings for adjusting the size and shape of it. When it comes to the axis subdivisions on a cylinder specifically, I try not to go any lower than 12, as it gets to a certain point where it's no longer really a cylinder. Like technically this is a dodecahedron. If we go down even more, like this is an octagon. It's not a cylinder. When you bring it into your scene, these corners are going to be noticeable. If you do a high poly version and you try to bake it, it's going to cut away a lot of those corners, and you're going to really change your shape. It's going to give you troubles with the bake. I recommend keeping it to a minimum of 12. Personally, I like to go in the 16 to 20 mark. And I always use multiples of 4. So, because right now you can see when I look at it from above, this can be quartered easily. So if for some reason I had to change part of it, or something on this side gets messed up, I can very easily just select the faces I want, delete them, and then I can mirror the object to recreate them. So even if I deleted all, shift not control, if I deleted the entire 3/4 of this 1/4 can be mirrored along the Z, and then I can mirror it along the X, and we can create our full cylinder again. I'm going to switch back to object mode here. And so you may have also noticed when I created the cylinder, there's this little box, which anytime you see this little box, it's an options menu. Clicking this will let you set those options before it creates. So sometimes it's useful, sometimes you want to do it after. It's your call either way. One thing to remember though is if you create an object like this and then you hit Control T, if you've adjusted anything, like for instance, if you've that's why. If you've created an extrusion and we hit Control T, see now it affects only the extrusion. If we delete the history and freeze transforms on this and hit Control T, now it doesn't give us any option block. So once you've altered the shape in any way, you can't use that Control T to change your options and adjust anything anymore. So it's very important, especially with cylinders or rounded objects, to make sure that you adjust that at the beginning, because adding extra edges to this cylinder is quite a pain in the butt, and going to take you a lot longer than you would like to spend on this. Once you've set everything how you want it, you can just hit W. Actually, you can hit W, Q, E, or R. Any of those tools will confirm your previous selection. So let's bring Jeff back in here and let's scale up our cylinder. So one thing you'll notice is that the gizmo is in the middle, and this scales from the middle. So I'm scaling it, above and below the ground. So, in order to get this the right size, I'm going to have to scale it and then move it up and then, scale it a bit more. A much easier way to do this is if you press D, you can change where your pivot point sits. So you can see when I hit D, it changes what your gizmo looks like. And, you can rotate it and move it off to the side. And now this is where our pivot is. It changes the angle of everything to whatever we've set that pivot point at. So we're going to use snap to vertex. So press D and get to this symbol. And then if you hold V, you can see that little symbol in the middle changes from a square to a circle. And so that means it's going to snap to the vertex. If you need it as well, X will snap to a grid line. But we're going to use V for this one. And then we're going to grab just the top arrow and snap it down to the bottom. So it'll always snap to the vertex that's closest to your mouse cursor. And this one's only moving up and down because we grabbed the just the Y arrow. And so we're going to snap it to the bottom. And then we're going to hit W to go back to our movement tool and confirm. And then down here in our modeling toolkit, let's just change that to 0. So now that we know this barrel is going to be sitting flat on our grid or on the ground. I like to do things this way especially if I'm bringing something to Unreal Engine. It puts the gizmo in Unreal Engine at the bottom of the object, and especially like for buildings, it makes it a lot easier for fitting things together. So we're going to scale up, and you'll notice now if I scale up, it just scales from the top. I don't have to worry about moving it up and down, and I can just focus on getting the size that I want. Which, that should be good enough. We don't need to be too specific. We won't need Jeff anymore, so we can just select him in the outliner and press hide and get him out of our way. So another useful point is don't ignore your outliner. I've seen so many scenes where you've got like poly shape 1 through 500 just completely filling this up, and so when the person has to find like a single piece that they're looking for, you've got to click through all of them, or sometimes you can't actually get to it in the scene. So make sure you're renaming everything. Personally, I always use the geo prefix for geometry. I'll use GRP for group. So now we've got our barrel. So one of the most useful tools is the multi-cut, which you can see over here on the right. But again, like I said, I don't like to move over to these panels unless I have to. So if you hit Shift and right-click with an object selected, you get a completely different menu. So again, just to demonstrate, with nothing selected in the scene, it gives me the Create Polygon menu. If I select an object and hit Shift right-click, then I get this whole menu with, honestly, this will have 90% of the tools that you're going to be using on any given modeling project. So I'd recommend really getting to the habit of using this. The same with, if you hit right-click without holding Shift, it gives you your mode or your component selection modes, as well as a bunch of other things from your upper menus. So again, it's a bit quicker than having to go over here to like pick faces or edges, when you can just right-click in the middle of what you're doing and change to whichever mode you need. So we're going to go Shift right-click and select our multi-cut tool. So again, these little boxes will always give you an option for the tool, all your different settings. We're just going to go straight to the multi-cut tool. There's nothing we really need to change about this. So when you're cutting, the red highlighted component is going to be where it cuts. So if I click here, it'll cut on this edge, and you can click and then drag to move where it is. But if I click on this red dot, then it connects it directly to the vertex. And then once you've entered your cuts, you can hit right click and then it finalizes, which we don't want that cut, so we're just going to Control Z and get rid of it. So holding Control while you have the multi-cut tool active will automatically create a full loop all the way around. It's important to remember that Maya only knows how to calculate this loop if it's running through quads. So if you've got n-gons or tries, like if I go to the top and hold Control, it doesn't cut all the way around for me. Additionally, if I create a loop here, it stops. Maya doesn't know what to do when it gets to the tries. So you have to make sure that your geometry is good if you're using this. Let's get rid of that. So holding Control gives you a full loop. Holding Shift and Control at the same time will snap that loop in 10% increments. And then that percentage is a measure of the distance of the edge that you're cutting. So from this vertex to that vertex. And then if you hold just Control and then middle mouse click, it will always snap to the 50% mark. So this is a very useful way to quickly and evenly divide your model. If it's too late for you to use the Control T to add extra subdivisions to the height, you can just do it this way. So I'm just going to go with our middle edge for now, and we're going to double click to select the whole loop, and then we're going to scale it out a bit for our barrel. And then go back to our multi-cut, and then we'll add 2 more. And the reason I did the middle one first is because I wanted these to already be a bit out. If I'd done all 3 of the cuts and then scaled up this one middle one, it only scales here. It kind of ruins our shape a little bit. That being said, it's not the end of the world. We can just scale it out this way. So one thing to also keep in mind is what I just did was grab the middle to scale, which means it scales it in every direction. So it scaled it up and down as well, aside from just in and out. You can, if you would like, these little squares, these flat squares, they always function on 2 axes. So like this green one functions on the X and Z. This blue one is on the X and the Y, and then this one's on the Z and Y. So for instance, if I scroll just or scale just on the X and Z, then you can see it's not moving them up or down, just in and out. Okay, so now we've got our basic barrel shape, but we're going to need a few more things. So if we want, say for instance, we wanted to put a lid on our barrel, we're going to use our multi-cut tool. But like I said, we can't cut a full loop. However, if you hold Shift, it will automatically go to the 50% mark of whichever edge you have highlighted. So we can just hold Shift and go and click our way around. You could have done this, like set an extra loop in here when we hit Control T when we first created the object. I specifically didn't so that I could show you this. But if you know you're going to need it, you might as well just add it from the beginning and save yourself some time. So now, again, Shift and right click menu. We can see that now we've redefined the topology, so everything here is quads. And so we can cut through this no problem. However, everything in here is still tries, and we can't cut through it. So something useful to do is select the edge we just made, and then scale it in. You can always delete the edge later if you don't need it, if you're trying to reduce your poly count or anything like that. But for now, for us working with it, it makes things a bit easier because now we can cut along the whole length here. So I'm going to hold Shift, and I think 10% should be a good size for our lip. And then we're going to switch to our face mode because we're going to extrude this inward. And so extrusion is something you're going to use often, but it can also be very tricky, and there's a lot of room for making mistakes. For instance, See, I just selected a bunch of stuff on the bottom that I didn't want to. And what does this is there's a function called camera-based selection, which is over here on the right. So if I don't want to select anything on the bottom, you can turn that on. And so what it's going to do is it'll only select things that you can see. And as you can see, I didn't get anything on the bottom or the back side. So very useful to pay attention to that when you're selecting things. Additionally, there's a few other ways you can select it. Holding tab will allow you to select and just paint your selection. So you can see when I hold tab, it changes my cursor there to have that little plus symbol. So then I just left click and I can just paint around. And then when I let go of the left click, now all the faces I needed are selected. This works the other way as well, where if you already have things selected and you hold tab, it creates that little negative symbol, and then you can just paint and deselect. So very useful. Additionally, deselecting can be a very quick and easy way to get what you want. For this instance, it doesn't help us too much, but we can hold Control, like we select everything, and then we can hold Control, and we can deselect the parts that we don't want to have selected. Same with hair, click Control, and because we've defined all these edges as quads, we can just double click, and Maya is going to follow the shortest path from the last selection to our current double click and work its way around. I held Control to deselect, but if you hold Shift, it will select and do the same thing. Again, this only works if it's in quads. If it is not quads, Maya does not know what to do or which path to follow. So I'm going to turn my camera-based selection back on and just select our top faces. So when you're extruding, there's a few ways to do it. You can hold Shift and just grab the gizmo arrow and pull it in whichever direction you'd want, which I'm sure a lot of you have done by accident. Have you ever been, selecting your faces and you're holding Shift to add more to it and you're like, oh, I missed this face, and then you did that and it didn't add the face selection and it doesn't look like it did anything, right? If we go to vertex face and split it apart, we can see now that there are these extra little edges. So what we've done is we've accidentally created a hidden extrusion, which will completely mess with your geometry. For instance, if I try to, oh, I didn't create one that was bad enough to ruin our geometry. But you will see that it can interfere with your multi-cut functioning, as well as when you are unwrapping the UV, you will see that you'll get errors, and it'll tell you have like non-manifold geometry, and that basically means it's something that can't be folded out flat. So I'm just going to Control Z and go back. And anytime you're using Control Z to undo an extrusion, make sure you go back far enough to the point where you were still selecting parts, because then 100% I haven't extruded yet. If you go back to just you're like, I think this is before the extrusion, you might still have those extra faces. You might still have the non-manifold geometry. I used faces here. But if I'd been selecting edges, it could have done the exact same thing. Almost completely unnoticeable, but you've got, once you zoom in, you've got all this, messed up geometry, and you're like, what is it doing? So back to our extruding. So you can use the Shift down, like it's no problem hold Shift and then use any of these arrows when you're doing it intentionally. It's just something you want to watch out for if you're doing it accidentally. Normally, when you're selecting things, be careful about holding Shift and hitting one of those arrows. So additionally, you can hit Control E to extrude, and it gives you this little options bar or menu, and then you can adjust. You can use the sliders to control things. If you find that your object is really small and moving this measurement is just moving it way too much at any given time, you can hold Control and then slide it, and you'll see that my numbers now start changing in the hundredths place, but when not holding Control, it changes in the tenths. So it's useful to know that just to get a bit more control when you are adjusting things. You can also click on it and just enter a negative amount or any amount that you choose. It's negative this time because I'm going down. Thickness and local translate Z often end up being very similar. Local translate Z just determines the direction based on the normals of the selected faces, which a lot of the time it does the same as the thickness. But sometimes it can do some things that are rather counterintuitive and you weren't expecting. Offset will pull things in and create extra faces. So for instance, if I offset on here, we're creating a face inside the face, which additionally you can do it to several different ones. And then you've got the option here to keep faces together, which you can choose off or on. So this can be very useful when you're trying to add additional detail inside of your model. But now we've got our extrusion that we want, so we've got our little lip here. That's good. And now we're going to need to add some of the bands that go around. So again, we're going to use our multi-cut. So Shift and right click and grab our multi-cut tool. Well, I should state that additionally, aside from hit the Shift button and dragging or using Control E, if you hit Shift and right click, there is an extrude option in this menu, and it gives you the same little option bar as if you'd hit Control E. They're the same function. So. And always make sure you hit Q, W, E, or R when you're done, so it finalizes the function. So now we're going to add our bands. So we're going to go Shift and right click and go to multi-cut. And we're going to set how wide we want our bands to be. So one thing to keep in mind is that this is a percentage of the distance here, and so if I want things evenly spaced, I can't go 80 here and then 20 here, because you'll see this row of faces and this row of faces are different size, which is because it's a percentage. So once you click the 80 here, you've changed the distance from here to here, and so 20% of this distance is not the same as 20% of this distance. An easy trick for that is you can use the Control and middle mouse click and create a mark at 50% here. And then when you use Control and Shift, putting 70% here and 30% here, as you can see, it is the same size. And then you can just delete those edges when you're done with them. So one thing to remember when deleting edges is do not press the delete key. Everything looks fine for now, but if I switch to vertex mode, you can see that it left those vertices there. So what appears to be a quad actually has 6 edges to it. So what you want to do instead is if you use the Shift and right click menu again, you have Delete Edge. And now if we look, we can see those vertices are actually gone like we wanted them to be. So I'm going to go back to my multi-cut and add the top part of our band. And you notice I am using a slightly different measurement here, just because the distance from this edge to this edge is not the same as the distance from this to this. And then once we've got our bands outlined, we can again just delete these edges. So now let's select the faces that are going to be in our bands. And so as I was saying earlier, deselecting is almost sometimes an easier way to select what you want. But make sure you have camera-based selection turned off. You could also use this view to just, select and then hold Shift to add. Depends on what you're working on. But just remember that deselecting, like selecting everything and deselecting what you don't want, can sometimes be faster. So once we've got our barrel here, or our bands defined and highlighted, we're going to extrude again. So Shift and right click, and then extrude, and we'll just bring our thickness out a bit. A lot of the time I prefer to actually enter a number, because sometimes the little slider thing is very inaccurate, and yeah, I don't like to see things that are at like 2.4 or 3.9. I like even numbers that run in 0.5 increments, which isn't always possible. So then we're going to hit W, and we're done with that. So if for some reason I wanted to make my bands a separate object from my barrel, we can select our extra edges very easily. We still got our middle faces of our bands highlighted. So if we hit Shift and Shift and period, it grows our selection. Hitting Shift and comma will shrink it. As you can see, that that face is highlighting now. So very quick way to change your selection. One thing to keep in mind though is if your selection starts to meet up like this, then it will redefine what is the middle of your selection. So for here, it's defining each of these bands of faces that we selected as the middle of the selection. If we join them up and then we start shrinking our selection, it's now redefined the middle of that selection based solely on the geometry and the space. So I'm just going to Control Z back so we've got this. So with our band selected, if we wanted to remove them so that they're a separate object, which we don't really need to do for a barrel, but I'm just showing you guys so you'll all know how to do this in the future. So select the faces that we want to extract or want to create their own object from, and then we get Shift and right click, and you will go down and you'll see we have Extract Faces down here. And so we can hit that. Make sure your offset is at 0 if you want to keep the shape. You can intentionally adjust your offset if you want to kind of change the size and shape of these faces as you're extracting. For this, we're just going to leave it at 0, and we're going to hit W. So now you'll see in our outliner, our barrel has changed, the symbol has changed, and it's become a group. And so we've got band 1, band 2, band 3, and then the barrel body. So let's rename this right away, because if we work on stuff, we will forget about it. Which actually, so now what if we have these 3 bands, but we want to make them one object? So we can select them, again hit Shift and right click, and down here we have Combine. So if you open the settings, you can change to like, merge the UVs and adjust the pivot position. If you don't click the toolbar, you do still get, nope, sorry, you don't get options. I was thinking of something else. But now we've created a new object, and we can see in our outliner that things are kind of starting to get messy. It's every time you combine or separate a piece, it's going to leave behind this little group node with this old transform node that we don't want. So one thing to remember is you can't just delete these because they're still tied to the object that they came from. So we have to ungroup them. So I'm just holding Control and clicking on the groups that we don't want. And then we go to Edit and Ungroup, which still leaves us with a bunch of these transform nodes. But we can delete the history. So in Edit, and then you have Delete by Type, History, and this will delete the history for whatever objects you have selected in your scene. If we go Delete All by Type, we can delete the history for the entire scene with just one click. And then you'll notice in our outliner here, all of those extra transform nodes, they've all disappeared. So these bands are now their own object, and they're going to pretend they've been their own object the whole time. So we've got our group for our barrel here still. So let's rename this one. And let's move our bands into the same group. So if you middle mouse click, you can just drag it and drop it. And then our barrel is all in the same group. And you'll notice that the pivot has moved itself back to the middle on these, whereas with the group, it stayed at the bottom, because it's reading that this was technically the original barrel, and so it remembered where the pivot point was for that. So let's just hide our bands, because now our barrel has holes in it, which we don't really want. To be quite honest, this would not make a difference, but I want to teach everyone about bridging. So we're going to double click to select the top row or the top edge loop, and then hold Shift and double click and select the bottom edge loop. And so now in our Shift and right click menu, as you can see, all of this stuff changes depending on what we have selected. And we're going to go to Bridge, which automatically fills in from the top loop to the bottom loop. It gives you, a bunch of settings over here that you can mess around with, to like add divisions or, twist it around, which can be very useful depending on what you're doing. But for this, we're good as is, so we're just going to hit W and confirm it. And then we're going to have to do the same thing here. But rather than having to go like Shift right click and select Bridge and hit W to confirm, we can just press G. G will repeat the last function that Maya has done. So that'll speed us up quite a bit, especially if there's something that you have to do over and over again for multiple things. One thing to keep in mind, though, is that, again, bridging works well with quads. With tris, Maya doesn't quite know what to do a lot of the time. And you have to make sure that you've got the same number of edges selected for either side. So like, just let me go back here. So if I'd done this and try to bridge, then we get this error down here. It says Maya cannot process these selected edges because the mesh is being bridged. It cuts it off, but it says that they need to be equal numbers. So this has got our barrel filled back in again, but we'll notice if we go to object mode and deselect it, now we've got a bunch of these really hard faceted faces. So what we can do, select the edges, and we're going to click and drag to select all the edges. Actually, we can do it on the whole object because we're going to soften these edges. One thing to keep in mind though is we want to make sure, hold Control and double click, and we're going to deselect the edges that we want to stay hardened, which are going to be just these ones. And then Shift right click, and we've got Soften Harden Edge, and we're going to go to Soften Edges. And now you can see we're nice and smooth again. So let's bring back our bands, and we can see everything fits together nicely. But one thing that I missed was at the bottom. I've completely ignored the bottom, because shouldn't the bottom be the same as the top? So let's fix that. I'm going to hide the bands again. And so let's go to our multi-cut, and we're going to cut right here in the middle. So this is the exact middle of our barrel. So let's select our faces, and I'm just going to go to the front view because it's a bit easier to select. And then we'll go over here. One way to always double check that your selection is what you want it to be. A quick way to do this is if you hit 4, you'll see the wireframe mode. So you can see through and see exactly what you've selected. Even if you had it on edge mode, you can see right through and see exactly what you've got selected to make sure. Hit 5 again to turn back on your shaded display. 6 brings in textures, and 7 it adds lighting. But we normally work with the 5 setting for most of the time. And then for the faces on the bottom here, we can just delete them. Let's go back to our object now. And so we're going to want to mirror this top half so that the bottom half is exactly the same. So in our Shift right click menu, we have got mirror right here. And I recommend opening, instead of just hitting mirror, open the options window. Only ever go straight to the mirror if you know what these option settings are, if you've used it recently. So for instance, one thing we do want to do is copy, and we want to mirror this on the object's axis position. So this is registering where this vertex, or where our gizmo is sitting. And so just as an example, if we chose it on world axis position, and we're going to use Y because we want to mirror the top to the bottom. And if we mirror it on the world, our thing isn't sitting flat on the grid. So it puts an equal space from the grid to the bottom as it does from the grid to the top here. So let's hit Control Z and go back. And we'll go to mirror. So we want to mirror it on the object's mirror axis position. So it's going to use this gizmo to determine that. We're going to set it to combine with the original so that it'll all be one piece once we're done. And we want it to automatically merge any of the border vertices so that we're not dealing with like holes in our mesh. You can also choose whether you flip the UVs or not, which we haven't done the UVs yet, so it's not a big deal. And then we hit mirror, and there we go. And so you can see there's like merging thresholds. So if I oh, okay, this one does not do it. If you use combined vertices, you can change this and it'll adjust stuff. But we're going to hit W. We're good. Let's make sure that everything merged. So we're just going to select any random vertex, wiggle it up and down. Okay, we're good. We can see that our geometry is all merged. And now our bottom looks the same as the top. And again, we can get rid of that extra edge we don't need, because that was just for measurements purposes. And then let's bring back our bands. So now we've got our barrel is done. This is the low poly version of our barrel. So we're going to duplicate this. I highly recommend getting into the habit of duplicating things often. We'll keep this barrel version and hide it. That's going to be our barrel version 1. And then Now we've got our low poly version. And so one thing I always make sure to do is bevel edges. So it depends on your poly count and how much, what your target is and what you're sitting at. Because right now I'm at, less than 500 faces. It's not a big deal. Um, but nothing in nature is going to meet up with these super sharp edges. Nothing that people build even will meet up with these super sharp edges unless it's very specifically intentional. So we can select our edges and then double click, hold Shift and double click to select them all. And I'm going to Shift right click and go to Bevel Edge. And so as you can see, it cuts down our edges, and we can adjust the fraction by how much. One thing to keep in mind, never go to the full 1 on this fraction, because what that ends up doing is it ends up overlapping your edges a lot of the time, and you'll end up with non-manifold geometry without even realizing. So for this one, I'm going to go, I think a 0.3 will be good. Just enough to round off that hard edge a little bit. It's not going to matter so much for this. On more complicated objects, I always try to set my segments to 2. So if, for instance, we had already done the UVs and we'd cut along this edge, and then we beveled, using one segment is going to push our cut in or out. If we use 2 segments, that cut is going to stay in that middle where we put it. So it depends on your poly count and the shape of the object, of course, but I highly recommend trying to use 2 segments over 1, especially if you've already done the UVs for it. 0.3, and that's good. We hit W to confirm, and now switch to our object mode, and we're going to do the same thing for our bands. I think the 0.5 is a bit too much. 0.3, and so we're good. Okay, so now this will look a lot better once we put it in our scene. If we'd kept the very hard edges, it's noticeable. It's definitely noticeable in your scene. And then additionally, say we wanted to make our lid removable. I turn on my camera-based selection so I don't get anything I don't want. And we're going to extract those faces again, just like we did before. We're good on the offset. We don't need to change anything. And here we go. Now we've got a separate piece. So one thing that you will notice is my pivot point isn't where we want it to be. So up here you've got recenter pivot, this little propeller looking thing, which I realize now probably is supposed to look like the gizmo actually. But we hit that, and then it puts our pivot point back to the middle. And so now we need to make our lid thick. And so we can just shift right click and go to extrude and adjust our thickness here. And you'll notice I had the object selected when I extruded, and it copied the geometry exactly on the top and bottom, which, as I say that, we don't need these inner edge loops anymore. So let's delete those just to get them out of the way. And then we'll bevel the edges on our lid. Let's make it 0.2. Yeah, we don't want it to be a big bevel. And honestly, it's probably unnecessary to do this at all, but it's more just to show you guys. Um, and so now we'll see our barrel, but the inside of our barrel isn't is hollow. There's no faces on this on the inside at all. We're just seeing the back faces. And so in Maya, it's fine. But if you were in Unreal, for instance, and you had this lid lifted up like this, you'd be able to see through the barrel, all the way through the barrel. Um, so we want to avoid that. And so we're just going to quickly and easily select our object and go to Extrude. Shift right click and Extrude and bring our thickness down a little bit. And I'm going down because if we go up, it's going to start running over the edges of our bands, which we don't want to do. So I just went down a little bit, just one, like -1, just to give it some thickness. But now you'll see it's all black, which means that all of our faces are inside out. And so again, if we bring this into Unreal Engine, we're going to see right through our barrel. So we're going to go up top here to our mesh display. And under the normal section, we're going to reverse them. And there we go. Now we've got our whole barrel is visible, inside and out. There we go. And I'm just going to bring our lid back down here. And there. So now we've got our barrel, and it even has a removable lid for if you need that. So now we've got our barrel, our low poly is all good. I should have, by rights, UV'd it on this version before I did any of my bevels. But we're going to go into UVing it with the bevels now, mostly because these bevels are full loops all the way around, so they don't really affect much in the course of our UVing. And so most people will go up to the top here, you'll go to UV and UV Editor, which gives you this pop-up window, which personally I find really annoying because as you try to move it around, it tries to dock with different parts of your display or like overtake your whole screen. So let's get rid of that. If you go up here to the top right to your workspace, you can change it to UV editing here. And so this puts it all, it gives you the exact same UV editor and the toolbox, but it puts it all, it docks it in, so it makes it a bit easier for us to work with. So Maya's automatic UVs are largely horrible. So we're going to completely get rid of those. So we're going to use right click for our component selection, but you'll notice when you're over the viewport and over the UV editor, you have different options here. So again, these right click buttons are always context sensitive. And we're just going to select UV shell, select all of it, and delete it. We don't want to see any of it. We're going to create our own. So we're going to go one piece at a time here. And so for our main barrel body, we're going to hit create and then go camera based. And there we go. So you can see the grid on my barrel, but you'll also notice it gets really twisted weird at the sides because this is not unwrapped yet. So this checker pattern showing up on your object is a way that you can see that everything is flowing evenly. You can use this little checker button here to turn it off and on in the viewport. The little landscape picture next to it makes it show up in the UV space as well. Personally, I find it just kind of like clutters things up and makes things hard to see. So I'm going to turn that off. So now we're going to have to cut apart our object. So I'm actually going to go to object mode, and if you select something in your viewport and hit Control 1, it isolates it. So I haven't hidden the other things. Well, I've sort of hidden the other things, but they don't show up as grayed out or hidden in my outliner like the top one does. And then we're going to go to our edge mode. And there's a few ways to do this. One thing you can do is to, get a good view of it for one. But if you double click and select a whole edge loop, or if you've selected any edges, you can go over here to your UV editor, hit Shift and right click, and then you can see Cut and Sew. I find a bit easier way of doing that is if you change to the UV editing tab, you've got this tool here, this 3D Cut and Sew tool. And so we're going to use that. And so what that does is when you double click, wait a minute, did you guys see that? Something. Well, okay, that's the inward extrusion. That's what that is. Ah. Okay, I was thinking something looked weird, but it's just because we extracted the top, but we didn't extract the bottom lid. But that's okay. So at the bottom, we've got our UV cut and sew tool selected. And so just double click and it'll give us a full loop. And so this tool actually, it follows the edges, but it only cuts from cut to cut. So let me turn that off so we can see these white lines a bit better. So I just cut these two, and now if I double click on this one, it only cuts from cut to cut. Whereas if I'd just been using my edge selection mode, it's going to follow that edge all the way up and around and through. And so if I go cut here, it's going to cut a bunch beyond what I wanted, and I didn't want it to cut in there. So just hit Control Z, a bunch, too far. You do have to be in edge mode to select this 3D cut and sew tool for it to actually work, and you do have to hit W or Q or E or anything when you're done with it in order for your right-click menus to appear the same. So for instance, if I have it selected and then I hit right-click, it's a completely different menu. Same with over here. If you do have an edge that you've cut that you want to sew back up, you can just hit Control and double-click, and then it'll automatically sew it for you. So I've got to get down inside here. And actually, if you ever notice this, where you're trying to click and pan it and it's moving super slow, it's because of the camera's relative distance to the focal point. So what you can do is select just an edge or a component, hit F. So now this is your new focal point, and you can see I can zoom and pan quickly and easily again. So you just have to redefine that focal point. Why am I not displaying an edge here? Sorry guys, I think so my extrusion process really messed up the inside of this. Do you see this? So, extruding inside things can totally happen to anyone. So let's go back to our object mode. Multicut, we're going to have to remirror this. Again, make sure your camera-based selection is turned off. There we go. And then We already had our mirror settings that we wanted, so now we're good. We will need to bring our bottom lid in here, but we will do that after. We're going to need to duplicate it. Okay, so let's delete this UV shell. Go back to object mode. You have to be in object mode to create a new shell. And then we go to edge mode and we'll start cutting it apart. So a cylinder actually folds out to be flat, a flat square. So we're just going to pick one side, double click, and I'm going to cut all the way around. And then we're going to want actually an inside and an outside to be clearly defined. So there we go. So now our UV shell, we right click here, we should have two. 1 and 2. So now select them both, and as I said, I try not to come over to these side menus whenever avoidable, but you will see that you've got unfold here, and you can hit unfold. Again, in the shift right click menu, unfold, unfold. So there's also, if you go to the arrange and layout section, you've got orient shells, or shift and right click, and then we've got orient shells down here. So this just kind of aligns them at a 90-degree angle. It straightens everything out a bit for you. But you'll notice these ends kind of flare. So if we turn our grid back on, you can see here they start to kind of take a curved shape to them. So we're going to want to straighten these out. So if you go to your shell, you can hit shift right click, and then we've got straighten UVs. Okay, which isn't doing what we want it to do. Like, you see how it brought these corners in a bunch and totally mangled them. So now these corners are going to be up inside and hidden, but we still don't want that. So we're going to hit Control Z, and we're going to switch to edge. And I'm going to select this edge, and then instead of using straighten UV, you can see it's changed our settings here again. We're going to go to straighten edge, or straighten shell. Nothing in Maya UVing works out the same every time, unfortunately. So there's a few different things we can do here, because we're not going to be able to straighten this UV the way that we want. It's going to keep messing up on us. So we have a couple options, one of which we can go to the edge mode and kind of cut out more here, which I'm personally not a fan of. I don't like having more cuts on my UVs than are absolutely necessary. So I'm actually going to manually straighten all of this. So we can just use the scale tool, and I'm in the edge mode, and then just double click the edges and then pull them in and scale them in. Things are going to start overlapping when we get to the outsides, so it's actually a good idea, right click and go to UV mode and do those first. Edge. Here to here. And it's pulled this bit back in, but don't worry about it, because when we select our edges and straighten them all out, it's going to kind of fix itself. There we go. So do the outside first, all the UV points on the outside, and then select edges. And then we can just double click on our edges and scale them in. And it looks like they're all overlapping each other now, but you can see by the time you're done the whole side, they've all fixed themselves. So admittedly, this is a bit tedious. Blender has a UV grid plugin for it that does this automatically and works beautifully. Maya, honestly, is the worst when it comes to unwrapping. Yes, beautifully tedious. There we go. But now if we look at our barrel, we can see everything is even, everything lines up. One thing I'm noticing though is our grid, our checker plate. It's a little bit wider than it is tall, right? So let's select our shell and we'll scale that. There we go. Those look even. And then we've got to do the other shell. One thing that's actually, I'm hoping this one will automatically straighten. Yes, this one did because it had a lot less deformation around these outside edges. But my UV shells are currently sideways. So it depends on what your material is going to be as to how much this matters. For instance, this is going to be wood, and wood grain always has to run the same, all the same direction, and it always runs along the longest length. So all our wood grain is going to be going up and down. But right now our UV shells are sideways. So let's select both UV shells. I'm going to hit E, and then we're going to hold J because that'll snap it in increments. And since they're straight up and down now, we know that this is perfectly straight sideways. Okay, so let's see. If we check our shells, this is the inside one and this is the outside one. But our inside one has that same issue. Yes, it's a little bit off. There we go. So those are even. And then we're going to lay them out so that they all fit in the 0 to 1 space. So select both UV shells, and then again, there's a layout over here on the right side, or we can shift right click, layout, layout UV. And so that puts them both back to here. But you can see from the writing, my inside shell is upside down, which won't matter too much for this specific project, but so if you go to edge, it's an easy way to identify, this edge is right here at the top where it should be at the bottom. So flip it over this way. And oh, both of our shells ended up upside down. And then we're just going to lay them out again just to make sure that they're in that 0 to 1 space. You have to keep all your UV shells in that 0 to 1 space here, unless you're using an UDIM workflow, which I'm not going to be going into. It's a more advanced technique. So we've got our barrel, and I'm actually just going to make sure, where is our cut edge? Oh, right here. And then our cut edge is right here. So let's grab our bands. We're going to hit Control 1 because we isolated. So Control 1 is going to bring this back in. And then for our bands, I'm not going to bother using the 3D cut and sew tool because these bands just need one cut each. But we do have to remember to create our UV shells because we deleted the previous ones. And then shift right click and cut. And then we select our right click and select our UV shell mode, and then shift right click and unfold. And shift right click and orient. So we've got top, middle, bottom. And then we're going to, again, straighten these UVs. Okay. And you'll notice, because of the way they were shaped, these ones kind of deformed a little. So we're going to select the UV point and then just move it over. So everything is nice and square and even. There we go. And I'm actually not going to lay these out yet because we still have to do our lid. So let's create using our camera based and switch back to object mode, and we'll hit Control 1 just to get that barrel out of the way. And so when unfolding this one, we're going to put one cut at the bottom. And to be quite honest, because these sides are going to be mostly hidden, I'm not going to put much time into actually cutting them or trying to figure that out. So if we hit unfold, we get it kind of popped our little edges out. And if we look at the edges, they're a little bit warped, but no one's going to really notice that. If you really want, we can select our edge here, cut it, pick a spot down here, cut that. And then we've got a straight piece. So 2 cylinders and a straight piece. Okay, now let's go back to our scene. And because we need to add a lid, I'm going to switch to object mode, and I'm just going to mirror it. No, I'm not. So if you hold Shift, it gives you the clone option when you're in object mode. And so I'm just going to hold Shift and clone. And then we'll move our lid down to the bottom here where we want it. So when you're duplicating an object, you've got a few options. So like you can do what I just did and hold Shift and then drag and it'll clone the object. You can also hit Control D and that'll duplicate. You never want to use Control C and Control V. Just break the habit of using it now. A lot of the time it doesn't matter, but sometimes, especially when you're animating, Control V will completely destroy your project. I've done it in the past where I've tried to copy and paste keyframes, and it just mangles everything. And there's no way to go back after you do it. Hitting Control Z will not fix it. So make sure you're not hitting the Control C, Control V, copy paste. Use Control D to duplicate, or just use Shift and then drag. And because we UV'd this object before we duplicated it, we've already got the UVs done for it. I'm just going to actually select both objects and then go over here and switch to UV shell. And then we're going to orient these so they sit straight. And again, Maya doesn't know which way it wants straight to be. And then select them all and hit layout. So in the process here, when I removed the lid and duplicated some things, some stuff got renamed. So let's actually select this one and we'll ungroup it. And then we'll select our barrel. And we'll delete all by type, oops, and edit, and history. And then we do still have a leftover transform node, but because we've deleted the history, we can just delete that, and we are good. So these are the bands. Lid 1. And you'll notice I work in using groups a lot. Don't combine things unless you have to. Working in a group like this, you can, collapse the group so it's not filling up your outliner at all on you. And it's a lot easier for you to adjust things later on, or like, oh wait, I need another lid that's exactly the same. I can just copy this. Whereas if I'd combined everything, I'd have to separate it and then hope that things still stay the same when I do. So work in groups. You can even export this whole object as a group and you're good. So now we've got all our UV shells done. They're kind of a bit of a mess over here. So the first thing we're going to do is layout. Oops, not unfold. Layout. And yeah, Maya is horrible for its auto layout and grouping. It just doesn't know what intuitive means. So we're going to have to readjust some of these. You always want to make sure you don't have anything overlapping. And if you hold X, you can snap to grid. So it'll snap to exactly the grid line or the 0.5 mark. And so we can just make sure that everything is lining up properly that way. So this is our top one, and this is our middle. And then unfortunately there is a fair bit of manual tweaking to make sure that things are laid out the way you want. Like you can go with the auto layout. Personally, I always do it manually. I just find that Maya is horrible for trying to really figure out what you want. Did I unfold those? Yeah, okay, they're fine. So now we've got all of our lid pieces on the one side, the outside and inside. Or is that the other way around? Yes, the inside and outside of our barrels, our little edges for our lids, and then our bands. So we are done with setting up our UVs and everything now. We're sure everything's inside the 0 to 1 space, so we're all good. So we'll go back to our workspace and change it to this standard modeling. And then let's go back to object mode. So focus, so we're in frame here. There we go. So that's our low. We're going to duplicate it and make our high poly version. So let's just hide that one. And let's see. So yeah. So hitting 3 gives you a preview of what it'll look like when the object is smoothed. Hitting 1 goes back to what it looks like regularly. Keep in mind that it is a preview. It does not actually smooth things for you. So one thing you want to do when you are making your high poly version is to actually add extra lines and kind of even out your geometry, because the subdivision is going to pull things because it's kind of splits the difference between your faces. So the more lines you have, the less it's going to pull. you doing? Oh, it helps if I'm pressing the right button. So I guess I probably should have left my previous cuts in here specifically for this, but we're going to go back over and redo it. And then again, right-click to finalize. Select both of these, and then we want to use the flat part because we've got two edge loops selected. So if we grab that middle square, we're going to shrink them down into each other, and they're going to scale on the Y value, which we don't want. So let's grab this so it's just on the X and Z, and we'll add a few extra cuts. Again, with the Control and middle mouse click, makes this super simple. And does it look like our lid pulls in a little bit too much? So because we added thickness, this little lip here is actually getting deformed, and that's what's causing it to look like it's pulling in. So we're going to just add extra edge loops on either side of that little lip. We're going to add them here as well. Just we don't want any deformation that isn't absolutely necessary. And because I'm inside the barrel now, it's messing with my zoom. So we hit F, select a component, just one of the edges, and hit F again to tweak it. And we got a lip here, one around here, one here. Three, one. Now you can see how much less it moves and pulls now. So switch back to our object mode. We'll hit Control 1. If we select the whole thing, there we go. So now our lid doesn't look like it's pulling in too far. One thing to keep in mind is how I just moved that barrel lid. Don't do that. You're going to want everything in your high poly to be exactly where it was in your low poly. Just otherwise your bake won't work out. I'm going to throw another one around these. And I want to keep a bit of this edge a bit stronger, so I'm going to add another loop in here. So I'm just using Control and middle mouse click to automatically find that 50% line or point. And it pulls it a little bit less, keeps it a bit more in the shape. Okay. So now that we've got everything set up how we want, I've actually decided I want my top lids. Oops. So so when you're selecting things, if you hit Control in your outliner it'll select just what you click on. If you hit Shift, it will select everything from the first click to the second click. So I'm going to hold Control just to get the lid, the top lid for my low and my high poly. And I'm going to pull it up and out. There we go. Just so the inside's a bit visible and we can see both sides of our lid. And then if we do want to, make it as a separate piece in Unreal or something like that, it's it's separated, it's away, it's visible. So now we've got everything set up. Let's grab our, which I don't know if you noticed, I did that with the low barrel, or the low poly barrel completely hidden. I just selected it in the outliner, so like you can only see the top one, but it did move the bottom lid as well, or the low poly lid as well. So now I'm going to select our, shoot, I have to do the same thing on this one and cut around. And so planning ahead is really important. If I had been thinking about it ahead of time, I could have not removed those cuts that I had. I could have also if I'd waited for the UVing, I could have just duplicated the top lid and then moved it, but we're here. So I'm going to scale it down so it's nice and close to the little. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. There we go. I'll even go a step further. Go one there. Just pulls a little bit less. Okay. So then we select our high poly barrel, and we're going to shift right click and go to smooth. And so this automatically smooths it with one division. You can change that to 2 if you'd like, but as you saw, it only did that for the bands. So it depends on what you've selected. If you select one object at a time, you can do as many divisions as you want. If you select a group of objects, it will only actually do more than one division for the one piece. So I'm just going to do the one division, and then I'm going to hit G, and we did it again. Ooh, that is interesting. Let's Control Z that, and I'm going to select the barrel again, and there we go. That's better. So now we've got our nice smooth barrel. So I mentioned I was going to discuss color IDing. And so this object is ready to be exported as is. So I'm going to do that first, and then we'll get to the color ID and I'll do another export. So let's bring in our high poly one. We'll do that first. So make sure that your pivot point is where you want it. I've got mine set to the ground where I like it. You could also just hit this button and bring it back to the middle. But then we're going to make sure that we delete the history and freeze the transformations. Do this for every single time that you export. Otherwise, you'll end up with issues later on, especially if for some reason your scale settings had something in the negative. It flips your model inside out and makes parts of it see-through and invisible in other software. So make sure you're always deleting the history and freezing the transformation anytime you export something. And then we're just going to go to File, and then export selection. I don't want to save it in our scenes folder, so we're going to go to our assets. Barrel high, and then enter. We're exporting as an FBX for this. OBJ works as well, but I find that OBJ automatically combines things, which sometimes you don't want to do. And so again, for our low poly, we've got our pivot point where we want, and you always want to flip back and forth between the high and the low to make sure your pivot point is in the exact same place. If it is moved, it will cause problems when you're baking. So we're where we want, so delete history, freeze transformations, and we're going to export our selection. Barrel low. And so for color IDing, it lets you put multiple materials on the same object. For if you had, something that you want a lot of detail in, or that there's just, you're using up too much UV space that you can't fit everything in or something like that, you can do it in multiple materials. And so a barrel is a bit overkill. You don't need to color ID for something like that. But for instance, what did I just do? For instance, for this engine that I did, there were 4 different materials that I put on this. So there was one for the wood, one for copper, one for the light colored metal, and one for the painted metal. And so it ended up being 4 different material sets that I put on all of these. And so in order to do that, we're going to go to your hypershade, which is this little blue dot here, and then we're going to create a new Lambert. So you can use either a Lambert or an AI standard surface. I find I'll often use the AI standard surface for color IDing when I'm doing my block out and I want to see kind of how the light is going to reflect and stuff like that. Because with the AI standard surface, you can change, not just the color, but the roughness, the metallic, transmission, all the different settings that you're going to want to need. So you can tweak with those and kind of have a base idea of what it's going to look like before you finish the actual texturing. For this, we're not going to use the AI standard, and I'm just going to use the base Lambert. And so make sure you change your name. I have a habit of using prefixes for everything. So I'm going to call this ID, and we'll call this one wood. And you can change the color if you want. It is only for your own visual recognition purposes. The actual color doesn't matter. What does matter is that each of your color ID materials has a different name. Lambert here, and ID steel. And yeah, like I said, the colors don't matter. Like I made them, they're brown and gray, but they could have been pink and green. It would still do the exact same thing. And then in our low poly one, so we don't need to ID the high poly version. We also don't need to UV the high poly version. Just so you're aware. So this one has the UVs on it because I did it on the low poly, but if for some reason those got deleted, it wouldn't matter. Baking only reads the geometry and the curvature. It doesn't actually look at the UVs. So for our bands here, we're going to select the bands and then just right click, and at the very bottom it's got assign existing material, and we're going to select our ID steel for those bands. And then for all the rest of the barrel, we're going to do the same thing and then select our wood. And then we're going to export it again. So we're going to delete history, freeze transformations, and then export our selection. Barrel low, but I'm going to add ID to this one. And that is it for our barrel. So I've shown you some modeling techniques. We've learned how to set up our workspaces, how to keep our workspaces clean, which is very important, especially if you're working with other people, like having 250 things here that all say polysurface. No one else will ever be able to figure out what you're doing in your scene. And then I've shown you UVing as well as color IDing. So that's it for this video. The next video is we're going to move all of this into Substance Painter, and I'm going to show you how that works. And then the one after will come back and I'll show you how to build your textures and your shaders in Maya and apply them, and then we'll do the same thing in Unreal Engine. So thank you very much, and I hope this has been helpful for everyone. Take care.